What would you think if I told you monsters are made, not born? That behind every man you fear, every face you label dangerous, violent, evil, there once lived a boy who cried silently into his pillow. A boy who was not given space to feel. A boy who learned early that to survive, he had to disappear behind his rage. His name could be anything. James. Elijah. Marco. A name whispered at the edge of a police radio, or screamed in the courtroom by a mother who no longer recognizes her son. But long before the mugshots, before the clenched fists and broken laws, there was only a child. A nervous system too raw, too exposed. A spirit never taught how to hold itself. He wasn't born with hate in his blood. He was born reaching, like all of us, for connection. But when a child stretches his hands toward love and meets only cold silence, sharp words, or the back of a hand, something in him starts to fold. He learns quickly that his needs are dangerous. That his tears are too loud. That joy is fleeting, and pain is forever. So he shuts the door on his own tenderness. Buries it deep where no one, not even he, can find it. You might say he started changing at 10. When his father left and never called again. Or maybe it began earlier, at 5, when his mother stood still while he was beaten by someone who should have protected them both. Or maybe the trauma was quieter. Neglect in slow motion. No bedtime stories. No warm arms. Just a house full of voices that never noticed when he stopped speaking. You see, trauma doesn't always come in the form of horror. Sometimes, it's the absence of softness. The vacuum where safety should have been. And that absence reshapes the architecture of a developing brain. The world says be a man. Don't cry. Don't feel. Fight back. Numb it. So he learns how to turn pain into power. Shame into fury. Abandonment into defiance. The first time he gets in a fight at school, someone claps him on the back. That's how you handle it. For once, someone sees him. Even if it's only his rage they're applauding. Can you blame him for chasing that feeling? You might think he had a choice. But ask yourself, how free is a child who grows up in a battlefield and calls it home? How conscious are your choices when your nervous system is hijacked by fear, when your soul has never known safety? By 16, he's already carrying more than most adults could bear. He doesn't call it trauma. He doesn't have the words. He just knows he can't sleep at night. That silence feels like drowning. That being touched, gently, makes his skin crawl. He trusts no one, not even himself. So he puts on a mask. Cold. Sharp. Dangerous. It's the only armor he has. And you see the headlines. The mugshot. The crime. You don't see the wounds beneath it all. You don't see the 6-year-old boy who flinched when someone raised a hand. You don't see the teenager who wished someone, anyone, would ask him why he was hurting. Anger, Dr. Gabor Maté reminds us, is not the enemy. Anger is the body's cry for justice. A protest against violation. A desperate attempt to say, this hurts. I matter. But when anger is the only emotion a boy is allowed to keep, it becomes his language. His identity. His shield. His sword. And underneath it is grief. A grief so ancient, so heavy, it hardens into violence. Not because he is evil, but because he has never known another way to be. Can you feel it now? The weight of a childhood erased. The silence between screams. The boy behind the man the world calls criminal. He wasn't born evil. He was born human. By the time he turned 21, his eyes no longer reflected youth. They were tired, guarded, not from age, but from carrying the invisible weight of years spent surviving. His body looked strong, but it was built from layers of armor, clenched jaws, hunched shoulders, fists that curled even in sleep. He didn't walk into rooms, he entered like a storm, loud, charged, and unpredictable, not because he wanted to hurt anyone, but because hurting first had always been safer than being hurt again. You might see him now and recoil. The tattoos, the scowl, the tension in his stance. But those are just the outer layers. Protective skin for the wound he never got to treat. Deep inside lives a terrified boy who never got to finish crying. He grew up in homes where emotions were seen as weakness, where love was conditional, and silence was survival. And so, like many others, he chose to survive in the only way he could. Maybe he drinks too much. Maybe he disappears for days. Maybe he lashes out when cornered, breaks things when he feels small, pushes people away before they can leave. Not because he wants to be alone, but because being left hurts more when you've allowed someone in. He didn't wake up one day and decide to be violent. The violence came slowly, quietly. It began the first time he wasn't comforted after being scared. The first time he asked for help and was told he was too much. The first time he needed to be held and was hit instead. Trauma doesn't always scream, it whispers. And its echoes are long. In school, they called him a problem child. Disruptive. Defiant. No one asked him what he was going through. They only saw what he did, never what he carried. He wasn't taught how to regulate his emotions, only how to suppress them. He wasn't shown how to express sadness, only how to channel it into anger. So when that boy became a man, the pattern continued. He never learned how to say, "I'm hurting." Only how to show it in self-destruction and fury. You see, anger isn't the enemy. It's a messenger. But no one ever listened to his message. Instead, they punished the noise. Locked him up. Labeled him. Rejected him. And every time they did, they only confirmed what he already believed about himself, that he was unworthy, unlovable, unredeemable. He looked in the mirror and saw the monster everyone else saw. But it wasn't the truth. It was the reflection of pain left untreated for too long. Have you ever wondered how different his life could have been if someone had seen him, not just his behavior, but him? If someone had said, "I see you're hurting, and I'm not afraid of your pain." If someone had taught him that emotions aren't enemies to be crushed but signals to be understood. Because beneath the rough exterior, beneath the explosive temper, beneath the criminal record, lives a nervous system locked in defense. A man who never truly learned safety, not in his body, not in his mind, not in any relationship. And when the world feels like a threat, every action becomes a reaction. He's not alone. There are thousands like him. Men discarded by systems that never asked, "What happened to you?" Only, "What's wrong with you?" But nothing was ever wrong with him. He adapted to survive. He learned to numb, to rage, to hide. And those were brilliant adaptations for a world that gave him no other option. But adaptations that save you in childhood can destroy you in adulthood. And eventually, the rage that once protected him begins to poison him. The walls that kept danger out now keep love from getting in. The survival mechanisms become prisons. Still, his story isn't over. Because no matter how deeply trauma roots itself, healing is always possible. But healing doesn't begin with judgment. It begins with understanding. It begins with someone seeing past the behavior into the wound. Past the crime into the pain. It begins when you realize that he wasn't born evil, he was born with needs that were never met. And he built a life around those unmet needs, mistaking pain for identity, violence for power, and silence for strength. But strength isn't the absence of vulnerability. True strength is the courage to face what hurt you, and to begin again. There was a night, quiet, unremarkable on the surface, when something in him finally cracked. Not the way things had cracked before, in fits of rage or slammed doors, but something deeper. A quiet rupture. A moment where the noise of the world went still, and he could hear, for the first time in years, the sound of his own grief echoing inside. He sat alone, in the corner of a shelter that smelled like bleach and rain-soaked denim. The walls around him were peeling. His shoes were worn thin. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days. The anger, the bravado, the sharp-edged mask he wore, it had all gone quiet. And in that silence, he remembered. Not everything. Not in a linear way. Trauma doesn't return to the mind like a movie you can rewind. It comes in fragments. Sensations. A flicker of fear in the chest. The image of a doorway he never wanted to walk through again. The weight of a belt in the dark. The sound of footsteps that meant run. He remembered the cold tile of the kitchen floor, where he used to lay face down, pretending he was invisible. He remembered the time he cried after his dog died, and his uncle laughed and said, "Real men don't cry over animals." He remembered the weight of expectation: be useful, be strong, be silent. And the unspoken truth beneath it: be someone other than yourself. That night, as the rain pressed against the windows like fingers trying to get in, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in years. Not rage. Not shame. But sorrow. Deep, unfiltered sorrow. The kind that makes your shoulders shake and your throat close. The kind of grief that doesn't just weep, it begs. If you've ever felt it, you know. That ache behind the ribs. The sudden realization that the pain you carry isn't just yours, it was passed down to you, like a curse no one had the tools to break. He didn't cry often. But that night, he did. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Just tears, hot, quiet, honest. And in those tears, something shifted. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was the beginning of awareness. You might think healing comes like lightning, a single, dramatic moment of transformation. It doesn't. Healing comes in flickers. In moments when the armor feels too heavy. When the mask slips just enough for a little light to get in. And he started noticing the light, not because the world changed, but because he began to see differently. He started recognizing the pain in others, the way a kid flinched when someone raised a hand too fast. The way a young man clenched his jaw when asked if he was okay. He saw versions of himself everywhere, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone in his suffering. There was no miracle. No overnight salvation. But slowly, painstakingly, he began the work of reclaiming his life. He met a counselor at the shelter, an older man who didn't flinch when he spoke of violence, who didn't shame him for his anger, who didn't ask him to be anyone but who he was in that moment. This man didn't offer cliches or quick fixes. He listened. And when he did speak, his words landed like medicine. You weren't meant to carry all of this alone. At first, those words didn't register. He had always been alone. But over time, they became a lifeline. A new belief, trembling in his chest: maybe I wasn't the problem. Maybe the problem was what happened to me. You see, when someone is finally allowed to tell their story without being punished for it, something incredible happens. The shame begins to loosen its grip. The body, once braced for attack, begins to breathe again. The heart, so used to hiding, starts to risk softness. And he did. In small ways. He showed up to group therapy. He helped a new kid at the shelter fix a broken bunk. He sat in silence with others learning how to feel. For the first time, he wasn't reacting, he was responding. Choosing. And though the road ahead was long and full of setbacks, one truth remained: the man who once lived only in survival was now learning how to live in presence. He would never undo the past. But he could stop it from defining his future. And in that quiet revolution, in that slow awakening, he was no longer just a product of trauma. He was becoming the author of something new. Some days, the past still came for him. It showed up without warning, in the way a stranger raised their voice, or how certain smells clung to subway tunnels like ghosts. Healing, he learned, did not mean forgetting. It meant learning how to stay when his body wanted to run. How to breathe through the heat of memory. How to whisper to his younger self, "You're safe now," even when the world didn't feel that way. He still had the scars, visible and not. He still woke up some nights gripping the edge of the mattress, his jaw locked, his chest tight with the phantom weight of things long gone. But instead of numbing out, he sat with it. Not because he liked the pain, but because he finally understood it. What once felt like a curse was now a compass. A signal pointing to places still in need of care. There were moments that almost broke him again. The job interview where he was turned away after they ran his background. The woman who recoiled when he told her about his past. The times he wanted to throw it all away because the world seemed uninterested in the man he was becoming and obsessed with the man he used to be. But this time, he didn't spiral. He didn't pick up a bottle or disappear into a rage. He talked to someone. He asked for help. And in doing so, he broke one of the deepest patterns of his trauma, the belief that he had to do everything alone. He started journaling. At first, the pages were stiff, the pen awkward in his hand. But the more he wrote, the more he unearthed. Not just the violence and pain, but the moments of tenderness he never thought he'd remember. His grandmother's warm hands. The way the rain sounded on the roof when he was small. The time he got a scraped knee and his older brother carried him home, whispering, "You'll be okay." That memory had been buried beneath layers of chaos. But it surfaced. And it stayed. Because the truth is, trauma doesn't just steal the bad. It steals the good too. The beauty, the connection, the softness. And healing, in part, is about recovering those pieces. Stitching them back into the fabric of who you are. He began to notice people. Not in the hypervigilant way of trauma, but in the gentle curiosity of someone rejoining humanity. He watched the way a father crouched to tie his daughter's shoes, the way a woman laughed with her whole body in a cafe, the way an old man fed the pigeons like it was a sacred ritual. And in those small moments, he felt it again, that ache. That longing. That quiet pulse inside that said, "I was always meant to belong here too." You see, for men like him, the hardest part isn't surviving trauma. It's believing they deserve something beyond it. He started volunteering at a center for youth at risk. Not because he thought he had all the answers, but because he remembered what it was like to be young and terrified and furious and unseen. And sometimes, the boys there looked at him with the same suspicion he once wore like a second skin. But when he told his story, not to impress, not to perform, but to be real, they listened. He told them about the pain. About the rage that used to eat him alive. About the nights he thought he wouldn't make it. And how he did. And sometimes, one of them would come back weeks later and say something simple, like, "That thing you said? I felt that too." And in that moment, he knew he was becoming the man he never had growing up. There was no grand finale. No dramatic transformation. Just the slow, sacred act of coming home to himself. And on the rare days when the sun caught him just right, and the wind moved softly through the trees, and he could hear his own footsteps without flinching, he allowed himself to believe it. That he wasn't broken. That he never was. He had been hurt. Deeply. Repeatedly. But beneath it all, the boy in him had survived. Not unscathed, but unbeaten. And now, the man he was becoming knew how to protect that boy, not with fists, but with compassion. He wasn't angry because he was bad. He was angry because he was broken. And maybe someone you know is carrying that same kind of quiet pain. The kind that doesn't show in words, but in distance. In anger. In silence. In self-destruction mistaken for choice. We tell these stories not to excuse, but to understand. Not to erase accountability, but to reveal where the wound began. Because when we see the hurt behind the behavior, we start to heal, individually and as a society. So if this touched something in you, share it. Not for clicks, but for connection. Because someone out there is still wearing the mask. Still angry. Still afraid. And they need to hear, you're not alone. Leave a like if this helped you see with softer eyes. Subscribe to the channel if you believe compassion is strength, and that healing begins when truth is finally spoken. And above all, stay with us. There are more stories to tell. More pain to name. More people to remind, you were never born broken.